Assalamualaikum, my name is Arfat and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I have with me the King James 1611 Bible again, and I would like to read to you from Deuteronomy 6:4. And I think it is very important for everyone studying the biblical text to actually start from the Old Testament and goes all the way through to the New Testament, because this is how the ancient church fathers would have been reading it in the Septuagint version, obviously. And I'm not sure. I've not done a survey of every Christians that I've encountered, and I've not asked them whether they actually finished reading the Old Testament, and actually have they actually studied the Old Testament from the historical perspective, as well as how Jews actually understood them to be. And I'm not even sure if they have actually read the interpretation of the early church fathers on the books of the Old Testament. Today, Christians normally goes to certain books of the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah, the book of Psalms, to kind of reread back anachronistically, because this is actually what the early church fathers does as well when they were arguing. If you study about the Trinitarian controversy, they were arguing by rereading back into the Old Testament the image of Jesus, so on and so forth. Like, for example, in Exodus, when God appeared to Moses, they would think that it is actually Jesus, right, who appeared to Moses. Although not all of them would think it this way, because God, Jesus is the incarnation, so to speak, okay, the Son that came down on earth only much later through the virgin birth of Mary. So who actually came? Obviously, Jesus wasn't born, all right. And so who saw Moses, or who came to talk to Moses in Exodus, right? And so there's all sorts of interpretation problem here, but that is not the video for today. And the main video, for the reason why I wanted to start with Deuteronomy 6:4 is because it is a very, very important phrase, and we get that later on in Isaiah as well. But Deuteronomy 6:4 is the crux of the phrase, right? And so it is there even in the 1611. Obviously, it is here, right? So, right. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love, this is verse 5, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day, okay, the God commanded Moses and the Israelites, shall be in thine heart. Okay. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children. It's difficult to read here. And shall talk of them when thou sittest in thy house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. So basically, you should teach this Shema. Deuteronomy 6:4 is so called the Shema. You should teach this Shema to your children, right? When they are walking, when they are lying down, when they rose up, meaning when they sleep, and then when they wake up, right? Jews will recite this twice a day, the Shema, right? When they wake up and then before they go to bed. Yes, Deuteronomy 7 commanded. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thy hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. Okay. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house, meaning you should write them on your doorstep, okay, on your door, and on thy gates. Right? So you write this Shema. Why did God, so to speak, why did Yahweh, okay, the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, Wahweh, why did the Jewish God of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, in this case it is the Old Testament because we're in the King James, but why did God actually emphasize this? Tell the Israelites, to tell your children whenever they go to sleep, they should recite the Shema. And when they wake up, they should recite the Shema. And they should, so to speak, tattoo them on your body parts. And then why should you put them at the doorpost, your door, engrave it on your door, as well as engrave it or put it somewhere at the gate of your houses? Why should it be this way? Because this is the fundamental teachings of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible. This is the fundamental teachings. And when we go to the New Testament, we find this as well. Right? We find this as well. Jesus preached the Shema, right? And then Jesus also carry on and preaching that you should love your neighbor, so on and so forth. And when Christians were reading the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they'll be bombarded with all these phrases, right? And when they go to John, John has one of the most strictest monotheistic passage as well, though not as strict as the Shema, right? And for some reason, when Christians interpret the New Testament, right, they will interpret it in a Trinitarian perspective, even though the doctrine of the Trinity is a much later development. I'm not saying that the roots wasn't there. No, certainly they were there, right? But they're not developed, right? The roots of when I say roots, basic means, right? Sabellianism, Petropassianism, all these dynamic kind of modalist Christology, they were there from the very beginning, right? But they're not the Trinity. In fact, the early church fathers, before the 4th century, or only much later in the 4th century, whereby they actually put an emphasis on homoousios, but before that they don't really define this, right? And no one actually, they have all sorts of different Christology, right? There are so many different Christology. Arius wasn't the only one. We have the Eunomian and Homoian Arians, those who argue that the Son and the Father the substance of the Son is like the Father. And then you have the Eunomians who argue that the substance is of the Son and the Father, they're not the same, they're of the different substance as well. So you have all sorts of these arguments. And this is the reason why historical context is very important, because none of the biblical authors were actually Trinitarian, right? It has been read back into them, and it has been preached, and it has been promoted, and those who preach a different kind of idea have been silenced unjustly, right? Whereby it is more on polemical grounds rather than on intellectual and academic arguments and rigor. And so because of that, and this is how the proto-Orthodox church actually won as well, right? By book burning, so on and so forth, and by not so much persecution in terms of physical harm, so on and so forth, but people were sent to exile. People were exiled. Church fathers that have bishops or even presbyters that have different views were actually exiled, and so on and so forth. And so it was a very messy, I would say, within the 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th, all the way until Chalcedon, because you have the relationship of Mary. What was Mary? Was Mary the bearer of God? For some reason, people disagree with that. That's why you have the Nestorian controversy, the Christological controversy. And so, to read back all these different Christology and this doctrine into the New Testament is actually a misunderstanding, I would say, a misunderstanding of the text of the New Testament. And historically, there are no grounds to argue, right? It is by unanimous consensus that historically the doctrine of the Trinity took years and years to develop, right? And the author of the Gospels, they were not Trinitarians. Now, obviously, fundamental Christians would disagree with this, right? And let's agree to disagree. But from the reading of the passages in the New Testament, there's a much stronger monotheistic sense then there's no such Trinitarian doctrine found anywhere. Unambiguous doctrine, such as the doctrine of the Trinity, right? It is not found anywhere. When I say unambiguous statement, I meant that not the doctrine of the Trinity is unambiguous. In fact, it is very ambiguous, but there's no unambiguous doctrine as much as the doctrine of monotheism in the biblical corpus, right? And so Christian would turn to passages like I and the Father are one, right? That before Abraham was, I am, right? And so all these passages, if you just read it by itself, it doesn't make sense, right? Before Abraham was, I am. If you tell that to a kid will not understand. But if you tell the Shema to a kid would finally get it, understand, right? And so, and also before Abraham was, I am. There are many different arguments out there that actually refute the Christian understanding that I am is actually the name of God, and Jesus is actually referring to himself as Yahweh, right? And in one sense, this is also not really Trinitarian, because if Jesus said that I am Yahweh, then Christians have actually fallen into the heresy, okay, of Patripassianism, right? Because the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity is that Jesus is actually not Yahweh, right? If Jesus is Yahweh, meaning Jesus is the Father, right? Because Yahweh is the Father. And in the doctrine of the Trinity, you have the Son, the Holy Spirit, and the Father. They are distinct, but yet they are one, right? And so if you just read in that passages, like for example, before Abraham was, I am, right? Or before who was, I am, right? It can be read in a Patripassianistic way, right? It cannot be. It is a much, literally is a very Patripassianistic Christology if you argue it that way, right? Because what does it mean? Like before Abraham was, I am. If I am is actually the word of the name of God, right? Then Jesus is actually the Father. The Son is actually the Father, but this is a heresy. This is not the doctrine of the Trinity, right? But it is because that the doctrine of the Trinity is so confusing. It is such a mystery that people have actually conflate between the two, right? Because from a logical perspective, if you just look at it from a literal sense, right? Before Abraham was, I, Jesus, am, right? I am is the name of God, right? Before Abraham was, I am, right? Like I am what? I am Yahweh, right? But then Jesus is not Yahweh, right? And so this is one of the readings, and I know Christians would disagree with this, fundamental Christians would disagree with this, because they would literally believe that before Abraham was, I am, is that Jesus is saying that he is Yahweh, right? But then that is not the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity is that the Son is very distinct from the Father. The Father is not the Son is not the Father, right? And neither of them are the Holy Spirit. Is the Holy Spirit. And so there's a lot of problems as well if you read the text literally, right? But when it comes to the language wise, I am is actually in the verse, in the context. If you read the context, I am is actually in the context of the verse. The word I am doesn't really refer to the name of God. And even though you find this in the translation, right? In the King James Version, you find this in the NRSV, the ESV as well. In all the study notes of the Bible that I've looked at, it says here that Jesus is referring to the name of God, right? But then if you read the passages in context, even though almost all the study Bibles actually mention it, but if you actually give respect to the context and give respect to the understanding of the historical understanding of the authors of the New Testament books, in this case John, right? It is a far-fetched Trinitarian doctrine. Like you have to push it, and you have to play around with the grammar a little bit to make it read the way you want it to read, right? And so, whereas if a doctrine is rigorous, like the Shema, right, it doesn't leave a lot of room to interpret it. And if people interpret it differently, then you can really tell that they are actually mistaken, right? So, as far as John 10:58 goes, before Abraham was, I am, that passage is actually can be argued in multiple ways. The Unitarians have actually used that to argue differently, right? And so the very statement itself is not rigorous, and the very statement itself is ambiguous, and the context can interpret it to mean differently, right? If you actually pay respect to the context and not just look at things the way you want it to be and read back your theology into the text, right? Because John wasn't a Trinitarian. How can John be a Trinitarian when the doctrine of the Trinity actually took so long? The first and second centuries, no one actually professes the doctrine of the Trinity. The one closest to that are the court of Tertullian, okay, the school of Tertullian, quote unquote school, right? Those who believe in the suffering of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, because these three are actually the same person, right? But that is not the doctrine of the Trinity. And to say that Jesus is Yahweh, that is also a heresy, right? Because Jesus is not Yahweh, right? Because the doctrine of the Trinity is that the Son is not the Father is not the Son, right? And so people can misconstrue it, right? If you read apologetic writings on this, and also if you look at videos of apologists trying to defend Jesus as God, but they themselves, when you ask them about the doctrine of the Trinity, you ask 10 different peoples and you watch 10 different videos, and they completely tell the doctrine of the Trinity differently, right? Because the doctrine of the Trinity is such a mystery that if you think that you understand it, you have actually misunderstood it, right? And so why would you believe in a doctrine that you cannot understand to begin with, and put your entire salvation in such a doctrine, right? But from a historical perspective, the passages can be argued in multiple ways, and so it is not a really strong passage to put one's entire faith in. Now, obviously, there are many different passages, right? But all of these passages can be refuted, can be looked at in a different way. Whereas if you just say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord," right? And you shall love this God with all your heart, with all your soul, right? And so there's not much to interpret here. Although people have actually interpreted different way, whereby you see there's God and Lord in the Shema, meaning there are two deities here, right? And this is a complete misunderstanding of the Shema. And perhaps I actually wanted to go through some of these notes using the 1611, right? But it's very difficult to read, so I'll just go through this note from the King James as well. But this is a much later. This doesn't contain the English of the 1611, right? This contain a much later. I think this is from the 18th or 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. So, we'll talk about circumcision. Okay? In Genesis 17:10, 12, 11, and 13, right, we read, and Abraham, no, that's the wrong passage. 17:10, yeah. Okay, and God says, "This is my covenant which ye shall keep," okay, which you shall keep, "between me and you and thy seed after thee," meaning your descendants. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. This is why I love the King James, because every man child, Like, it's such a wonderful English. Every man child is unique, is different. Right? Every man child among you shall be circumcised. Right? Meaning every infant. Right? Every man child among you shall be circumcised. Every male infant, male baby. Right? And we go to Genesis 17:11. And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant between me and you. And then verse 12, and he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you. Again, every man child in your generations. He that is born in the house or brought with money of any stranger, meaning if you buy this child, if you buy this infant, you should also circumcise this infant. Because in the past you can actually buy human beings, right? Now you can't. Now you can enslave human being, right, by paying them monthly and get them to kind of work for you in a sense, right? So this is what we call modern day slavery. But either way, he that is born in thy house and he that is bought with thy money must needs be circumcised. Okay, must needs be circumcised. What a great English. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. Right? An everlasting covenant. Now, the reason why I brought this passage up is because when you ask the Christians, who is speaking here? Right? Yahweh is speaking. According to all Christians, who say Yahweh is speaking. Right? And so if you go to John, like the Abraham passage, John 10:58, before Abraham was, I am, meaning Jesus is Yahweh, right? Meaning Jesus is actually speaking to Abraham here. And so Jesus is saying, right? Jesus, Yahweh is saying, because they are one, right? They are the same thing. Right? Jesus is saying in Genesis 17:13, right? He that is born in thy house and he that is bought with thy money must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. Everlasting meaning forever. Right? And so Christians need to circumcise, because this is Jesus telling them. Jesus telling them to circumcise. Right? Yet for some reason, when we go to the New Testament, Paul mentions that the Gentiles doesn't need to be circumcised. Right? But Jesus here is saying, because according to John 10:58, before Abraham was, I am. Like Jesus is Yahweh, right? And so Jesus is saying to Abraham that you should circumcise. And this is my everlasting covenant. Okay, you should circumcise. But then Paul came much later and said that Gentiles don't need to circumcise. Right? Abraham is not the father of the Jew only. Abraham is the father of the Gentile as well. Right? And so this is selective. If you use the Christian narrative, like Christians don't want to circumcise, this is selective. Right? Because Jesus tells them to circumcise here. Right? Again, if we look at things from a historical perspective, then definitely Jesus is not speaking here, because Jesus was born, I don't know, probably 2,000 years later, so on and so forth, depending on 3,000 years later if you put Abraham to be in the 18th century or BCE, right? 2,000 years, 2,000, yeah, about 2,000, 3,000 years actually, 3,000 years. The next one is here, right? And so in 2 Samuel 9, chapter 9, verses 6 and 8. Okay. Now when Mephibosheth, I'll just butcher that one, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, Behold thy servant. Right? And the reason why I pointed to this passage is that in Matthew, like, the Magi came and they want to worship Jesus. All right, and that is in the King James. In the NRSV, the Magi came and they pay Jesus homage. Right, and this is in Matthew chapter 2, if I'm not mistaken. And so either way, the verse here that I just quoted in 2 Samuel chapter 9 verses 6 and verses 6, verse 6 actually, right? We have an incident of someone, Mephibosheth, okay? He actually come unto David and he fell on his face, okay, and did reverence, meaning this person did reverence to David, right? The reason why I pointed out this verse again, I just want to finish my thought here, is that when you look at some of the apologetic videos and apologetic arguments that are put out there, is that Jesus is God because even the Magi came and worshiped him, right? A lot of people use the KJV, the NKJV translation, because it has the word worship him in there, right? Only a few would use the NRSV because the NRSV have paying homage to Jesus. But either way, this whole concept of paying reverence and paying homage and worshiping another human being, right? The argument is that, because the Magi came to worship Jesus, that's why he's God, right? Or the Magi came to pay homage, i.e. reverence, that is why Jesus is God. And so using the same argument, right, using the same principle, then David here is God, right? Because Mephibosheth actually paid David reverence. In fact, Mephibosheth here is mentioned, he fell on his face. Mephibosheth actually fell on his face, meaning he makes sujood to Daud, right? A'udhu billah. He makes sujood to Daud. Does that mean that Daud is God? Okay, David is God? No, obviously not. No Christians will accept this, right? And so the argument that they use is actually selective, right? And so we need to have some consistency. Any argument that you bring on the table must be able to be applied to another human being, so on and so forth, in this sense, right? And if you feel that only Jesus here is God, but David is not God, even though the same thing, like they're paying homage, they're paying reverence, right? The Magi doesn't fall. The Magi doesn't fall. The Magi didn't fall on their faces. I don't know how many Magi came. Right? Doesn't fall on their faces and actually worship Jesus. But here, he fell on his face. Mephibosheth actually fell on his face, okay, and did reverence to David, right? And so the same principle when used with Jesus, it is, Jesus is God. But when the same principle is used to other figures in the Bible, they're not God. And so this is a kind of a double standard. And so we need to be more careful in our argument, in how we present our argument. Perhaps there's a few more here that I feel would be great. Praying. All right. There are two choices here. Either you accept that God pray, or God doesn't pray. In fact, he is being prayed. Like people pray to him, right? And so either God pray or people praise to God, right? And so if Jesus is God, right, then you will find that if you accept that Jesus is God, that means God pray. But who is God praying to? Right? And so in John 14:16, okay, Jesus prayed to the Father, In John 14:16, here we read, I will read from verse 15. If ye love me, keep my commandments. Right? And I will pray the Father, and he shall give you another comforter, that he may abide with you forever. Right? There are two things going on here. One thing is that Jesus is going to pray for his disciples, okay, to the Father, right? That the Father, okay, shall give the disciples another comforter. Okay, according to interpretation, this is the Holy Spirit. And he, the Holy Spirit, may abide with you, okay, the disciples of Jesus, forever. Okay? So one thing going on here is that Jesus is praying to the Father. Right? If Jesus is God, then why can't Jesus just fulfill the wish of the disciples, right? Or just give the disciple Holy Spirit? Why must Jesus pray so that the Father will actually send the disciples the Holy Spirit? Right? If Jesus is God, then he would just, send the Holy Spirit. He has the authority. And the other thing here is that the phrase that he may abide with you forever. Right? In another passage in John, I and the Father are one. This passage has been used to say that Jesus is God. Right? Again, this passage is actually not Trinitarian. Okay, this passage is actually a heresy. Right? It promotes an heretical doctrine. It is not promoting a Trinitarian doctrine, because in the doctrine of Trinity, the Father is not the Son is not the Father. Right? And so I and the Father are one, meaning if Christians say that I and the Father are one, meaning Jesus is the Father and the Father is Jesus. This is the doctrine what the Tertullian espouses, and this is heresy. Right? But the very fact that the Comforter may abide with the disciples of Jesus forever can be argued also in a sense using the same principle, okay, that the disciples of Jesus is also God, right? Because if Jesus and the Father are one, right, the Holy Spirit abiding with the disciples of Jesus will also expand the Godhead, right? If you look at things from that perspective, right? But no Christians will actually agree or will actually promote that is the disciples of Jesus, they were or they are God, right? The Catholics and the Orthodox differ from the Protestant in that the Protestant do not venerate the saints, right? The Protestant do not venerate the saints, unless I'm missing out something here, right? But the Catholics and the Orthodox actually they venerate the saints, right? By veneration of the saint is just like the not really, but just like the Shi'i Muslim, they venerate their imams, like the people in certain parts of I'll not say the country, certain parts of the Southeast Asian continent, they would actually venerate the wali, for example, the holy man, right? They will go to the grave and then they will make dua, they call it wasila, right? But this is completely against, like, how can you make wasila to a dead person, right? And so this is the same concept, but there's a slight distinction here. Yeah, but kind of the same concept whereby they venerate the saints. They pray to the saints because these saints are holy men, they're a holy person, and then they're disciples of Jesus, for example. They pray to, John or Petros or Jakub, okay, James, Peter, and John. And so because they are very close to Jesus, in fact, they were disciples of Jesus, and so they make dua. These disciples or these saints, they are like intermediaries or intercessors between them and God and Jesus, right? But if Jesus say here, the Holy Spirit abide with the saints, meaning the disciples of Jesus, right? how come the Protestant don't venerate the saint? Again, unless I'm missing out here, right? And so the Protestant would say that veneration of the saint is actually um, shirk, right? It is against monotheism, right? That is what I've heard some Protestants say. I'm not sure if any other would agree with them, right? Unless I'm completely missing out here, you must correct me, right? Protestants don't venerate the saints, right? Venerating saints and respecting the saints are completely different thing, right? Venerating a saint is like you make dua to the saint. You make tawaf, you circumambulate around the grave, right? Like people circumambulate around the grave of the wali, and so why would you do that, right? Unless you really believe that this person can act as your intermediaries, right, between you and God. But either way, I digress. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully this presentation demonstrate that there's the concept or the argument or the methodology behind this argument, or the way the argument is actually being presented by missionaries, by fundamentalists, by evangelists, can be questioned, can be easily refuted. And when we look at the flow of the argument, we can actually apply the same standard to a different verse. But for some reason, this group of people, they would actually reject, as I've just demonstrated, like people worshipping to David, okay, prostrating to David, and yet the Christians will not accept David as God, right? But when the Magi came to worship Jesus, to pay Jesus homage, right, they would accept Jesus. Oh, this is part of the reason why Jesus is God, for some reason, right? But again, if you look at the argument collectively, they pick passages here and there, here and there, here and there, here and there, and then they actually form a very strong so-called Trinitarian passage, right? Whereas the same thing can be done, right? I can pick up monotheistic passage here and there, here and there, and there, even in John's Gospel, right? And I can completely argue otherwise, right? And so by picking up passages here and there, that doesn't actually support one argument. In fact, it is not a strong way to actually put your argument forward, right? Because it is selective. You're just selecting things that you feel is actually supporting your theology, right? In fact, before you arrive at your theology, you should actually look at what the passage actually says and try to understand the passage. And obviously, all of us have biases, right? But the best way to question our bias and to question the very methodology that we use is that if we apply a certain principles to a passage, right, and if you apply it elsewhere, right, will we reject the conclusion here and accept the conclusion here, right? That is one way to recognize our bias, right? And if we actually read into the text, right, if we ignore the historical context, if we ignore the vast sources, materials that we have, and just bulldoze through all these different sources and then just interpret the way we want it to interpret, right, then there is no merit to our discussion, right? There is no merit to our argument, right? Because first of all, you do not present your method. Second of all, you're not rigorous in your approach. And third of all, the very methods that you use can be used against you, right? And so we should think before we, obviously this can be argued both ways as well, right? If I can pick up passages that portrays Jesus as a monotheist, and then the Trinitarians can refute that by bringing up passages, all right, that supports their theology, all right. And so this is a question about methodology, this is a question that the very methods and principle that we use to arrive at our conclusion, that very method itself is flawed. So we shouldn't use it because it is flawed, right? And so we should use a different kind of methods, right? But either way, I digress. Hopefully this video was fruitful, and I'll see you on the next one. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.